So as a faculty member here in the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, my field of expertise is international environmental cooperation and negotiations. And as part of my work there, climate change is of course an essential area. President Trump recently announced his intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Accord on climate change. Now this is going to be a fairly long process. The soonest that can happen is about 3.5 years from now. So a lot of things can change in the meantime. Politics change, cast of characters change, and so forth. But right now, the United States has announced its intention to withdraw, and the president also said that the United States would, effective immediately, stop fulfilling its non-binding obligation under the Paris Accord, and that involves anything in the national determined contribution that the United States had submitted alongside with joining the accord. And the core piece of that was the Clean Power Plan, efforts to address vehicle emissions and so forth. And the president then announced that his administration would review all of those rules and see which were feasible to basically roll back. So the Paris Accord is a global, legally binding agreement that almost all of the world's countries, virtually all of the world's countries, have joined the accord. All of the major economies and major greenhouse gas emitters are part of the accord. The accord is legally binding, but the promises that countries have done as part of that accord are outside of the accord and are therefore not, strictly speaking, legally binding. Which then means that it's easier for a country like the United States to renege on its earlier commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because they were not legally binding as part of the agreements. They were part of a political commitment that was attached to it. In response, all of the other major players have announced that they will stay with the accord, that they will not renegotiate the accord, and that the accord is the arena in which they will continue to talk about climate change, irrespectively if the United States is part of that process or not. In many ways, the Paris Accord is the culmination of over 2 decades of international, both scientific and political cooperation around this. It started with the Framework Convention on Climate Change that was adopted in 1992. We had the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the 2009 Copenhagen Accord, and then in 2015 we got the Paris Accord. And alongside these rather tumultuous political negotiations at times have been a continuing scientific endeavor to investigate human-induced climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, its series of reports, have been instrumental in this process. And for each and every report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have come out with stronger evidence that not only that there is climate change, but that humans are the main drivers in this process. And right now there is a virtual consensus within the scientific community around the core ideas of human-induced climate change and human activities releasing greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, but also methane and others, and those being the main drivers of the current climate change that we are witnessing. So there is currently widespread political acceptance internationally of climate change. Of all of the major countries, China, India, the European Union, Brazil, major and smaller developing countries, everyone agrees that climate change is going on and something needs to be done. What there's less widespread agreement on is exactly who should do what in addressing climate change. And the way that international law works and the way the international system works, countries have to join these agreements voluntarily. So it's entirely up to a country whether they want to join an agreement like the Paris Accord or not. Once they do join a legally binding agreement, they are committed under international law to do it, but it's up to them to decide whether they want to join in the first place. Therefore, it's very difficult to design an agreement that appeals to all countries, even if they do agree that there is a problem. If there's huge disagreement among who should actually do what obligations different countries should take on in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emission, providing financial support, technology transfer, capacity building, at what rate they should take action, how much money they should commit, and so forth. It was a very long and difficult negotiation process that resulted in the Paris Accord. The United States, under the Obama administration, was one of the key players in many ways. Without American leadership and bringing the Chinese on board, we would never have had the Paris Accord, which is then why it's both ironic and a little bit sad that one of the main architects behind the Accord, the United States, now is one of the fiercest critics of that very same accord. The Paris Accord is a fairly good platform for continuing cooperation. It's also, in fact, the only platform that we have, as in it's the only global agreement around which countries have committed to work forward. And one of the goals, one of the main objectives of the Paris Accord is to keep average global surface temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius and aiming to get towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. With the commitments that countries have done so far, we are nowhere near that. So if you calculate all of the promises that they have made in the current national determined contributions, we are nowhere near the 2 degree target. Estimates differ a little bit because it's a little bit difficult to assess exactly what would be the impact of all the different NDCs, but a lot of estimates put it around 3 degrees or thereabouts. So we're going to need a significant ratcheting up of commitments and efforts over the next decade or so. Even if that were to happen, it's still uncertain whether it is actually possible to reach the 2 degrees Celsius target. And pretty much all experts agree that the only way we're going to get to the 1.5 degree target is not only if countries take much more significant action, but we also need to find some way to take some of the carbon dioxide that are currently in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere. As in, we are not going to be able to get to the 1.5 degree target by simply ratcheting up existing commitments. We're also going to need some technical solutions to trying to get some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's unclear, both sort of technically and politically and institutionally, how we would move forward of trying to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Designing an amendment to the Paris Accord or a new agreement would be one way of doing it. It's not at all clear, though, that an international agreement is required. I think it depends partially on the type of technology that gets developed, how it will be done. But there's a lot of discussions around various forms of geoengineering. There are a lot of people who are very cautious about these kinds of things because it would be another way in which humans interfere with a natural system. And it is currently unclear exactly what kind of consequences that would have. There are those that worry about unintended consequences of even further human tinkering with the climate system. So all of that is very much up in the air. So IPCC and other scientific assessments are clear that climate change will have global ramifications. It will impact all countries, but it will impact countries in different ways and in different stages and in different speeds. And also some countries are already more vulnerable to climatic changes than others, as in they have less of a buffer zone, as in once we start seeing greater temperature increases, more erratic weather patterns, sea level rise, some countries will be hit harder than others. The traditional countries that are being pointed out as particularly vulnerable are the low-lying island states that are particularly sensitive both to severe weather, hurricanes, and also sea level rise. But also countries in Africa, they're already very dry and they rely heavily on agriculture, both subsistence farming and more commercial scale agriculture that can be hit by very small temperature changes or changes in precipitation patterns. There are also low-lying countries like Bangladesh and India and others that could be hit by storm floods, changes in weather patterns, and so forth. There will also be different impacts in different countries, as in different regions of the United States would be impacted in different ways. The impact here in New England will be different from the impacts in Florida, which will be different from impacts in Southern California, for instance. The former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, said it was the defining issue of our lifetime, of our generation. And it's something that is reflected in the current high-level political attention that climate change is receiving from world's presidents and prime ministers and politicians and civil society organizations and church groups and the private sector and business leaders. And it has become an issue that has definitely broken out from being simply an environmental issue, and it's much more of a sustainable development, future of the planet issue.